Hello, everybody. We are back to the subject of forgiveness. Yesterday, we ran a show with the American legal authority, Jeffrey Toobin. He has a new book out, The Pardon, The Politics of Presidential Mercy. And Jeffrey Toobin talked to me about everyone in his mind should have a second chance, including himself and even presidents. We're dealing with forgiveness, but in a much heavier, I think, more serious way, with my two guests today, Colum McCann and Dianne Foley. Colum wrote American Mother. Dianne Foley is the mother of the subject of American Mother, her son, who was murdered by ISIS terrorists. And they're both joining us today. I'm thrilled to have them both. It's a real honor. Perhaps, Dianne, we'll start with you. You work very closely with Colum on the book. He wrote it, but it's in your voice. Is it a book about forgiveness, or is that a trite way of treating it?
I think that's an aspect. It's about kind of redemption too. It was such a horrifying ordeal to have Jim kidnapped by ISIS and essentially disappeared for 2 years, and then for him to be so brutally publicly murdered. And so it's a book about the ordeal and about the need to push through that grief and find the silver linings, find the good things. I think when bad things happen, a lot of good people step up. That was certainly been my experience.
Did you have to, I get the sense from the way in which Colum wrote the book that forgiveness comes naturally to you. Is that fair?
Well, I don't think forgiveness is natural. But it is challenging. I mean, I think I'm a Christian, a Roman Catholic, and forgiveness is an important part of being a Christian. So that is the challenge, to be merciful and to forgive others. We all make mistakes. None of us are perfect, that's for sure. And so to have that merciful, attitude is what we're called to, what I feel called to.
Colum, this was quite a challenge. I know that you originally wrote Dianne a note after the original murder of James Foley, because there was a photo of him reading one of your books. She didn't respond because she didn't get it, and then you connected up and you agreed on this project. It's a kind of a triangular project, isn't it? On the one hand, it's a book about Dianne. On the other hand, it's a book about her son. Is this the biggest conceptually challenge of your writing career?
I mean, every book is a challenge. I mean, what I wanted to do was to capture the grace and the courage and of Dianne and this particular moment. I mean, I'll set the scene for you. If you can imagine this, 7 years after Jim's killing, we walked into a Virginia courthouse, and there were lots of people there. There were court officers, there was FBI, there was CIA, there were defense, there was prosecution. But Dianne walked across this big echoing room and into a corner where there was a table where Alexander Cody sat with shackles on his ankles, and he in his green prison jumpsuit. And Dianne stood and she said, "Hi, Alexander. It's nice to meet you," which is in itself was an extraordinary thing. But then what unfolded over the next 2 days, as Dianne talked with him and I witnessed what was going on, and then we came back again 6 months later to spend a third day with him, was some of the most startling things that I've encountered in a human setting, talking about love and pride and pity, sacrifice, violence, compassion, war, all of these things. And then one of the most extraordinary things is that this is only a small part of Dianne's life, because in the other part of her life, she has had the courage to go ahead and to basically almost single-handedly help change hostage policy and the way we think about hostages. She would argue that it's not single-handedly because she's very, very gracious with others. But you know, to be in that room and to be a part of her life for a year or more, and to still be part of her life because this book is ongoing, was for me a great honor, and yes, a challenge.
Dianne, perhaps you might, not everyone watching certainly will have read the book, or perhaps even be familiar with the tragic story of your son. Perhaps you might very briefly tell everyone what happened.
Sure. Jim was a ordinary young man from New Hampshire, very curious, who was very interested in the world, very interested in other people, a very good listener. And initially, he thought he wanted to be a teacher and a writer, and spent years doing that. So he came to journalism later in his life. He was in his 30s when he became a journalist, and became a conflict journalist because his siblings were already in Afghanistan and Iraq, serving there. Jim became very passionate about the people in the Middle East, their yearning for the freedoms that we so often just take for granted. And he was very committed to bringing those stories to us. So, however, in 2012, at Thanksgiving of 2012, he was kidnapped and really disappeared for the next year. And it turns out it was ISIS who had taken him, and you know, he was starved and tortured, treated terribly. Finally killed in August of 2014. He was brutally beheaded, and it was that horrific picture that went all over the internet. And that was the beginning. I mean, there were 3 other Americans who were killed after that, then some British citizens. I mean, ISIS had no mercy. They killed thousands of people. But I was particularly upset to find out that our government had nobody whose job it was to help me bring Jim home. I quit my job and did what I could to raise awareness through the media, but also by going to Washington. And there was no one whose job it was to help me. So I was kind of sent in circles, patronized a lot. And so after Jim was killed, I felt as Americans, we could do better. So that's when I founded the Foley Foundation with the help of many good people. And that's when many people within the government and outside helped me to change the policy and actually structure the current policy that has brought home nearly 150 innocent U.S. nationals since 2015. So it's really quite remarkable what has happened since then. So that's in a nutshell what happened.
Yeah, and one of the astonishing things, I've been reading the book all morning. One of the astonishing things is that your son it was the second time he was kidnapped. He was also kidnapped in Libya.
Yes, he was. Yes,
it's an astonishing story.
Well,
and one of the sort of the memorable pieces I thought in the book was a little bit of, maybe this is the way at least Colum wrote it, a sense on your part of guilt that you didn't aggressively try to persuade him not to go again. Some of his friends did. It must be a horrible, I don't know whether you're torturing yourself, but the notion that perhaps you as parents, mother, your husband, could have done more to convince him not to go for the second time, given that he got kidnapped the first time.
Well, if you have a young son in their late 30s, Jim knew what he wanted to do. There was no dissuading him. There really wasn't. You know, we all, counseled him against it, but he was committed. He felt, and he had been in and out of Syria for more than a year, many times in and out of Libya. Yes, he was held for 40 days in Libya, and by the grace of God came home. He knew it was dangerous. He really knew. But he felt that what he was doing was very important. And he really felt it was his job to get it done, that we might know what's happening in that part of the world.
Yeah, certainly a remarkable character. And he comes out of the narrative column. I thought that you did a wonderful job presenting Jim from in the eyes, in the mind of his mom. It must have been a struggle in that sense, because you weren't writing about him, but he is still the central figure in the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it got to the stage where I felt that I knew Jim, and that he would have been a good friend of mine. In fact, there were certain times I felt that he was sitting on my shoulder, whispering in my ear, sometimes admonishing me or whatever. Because I wanted to get the story correct. In fact, the first time I met Dianne and her husband John, they actually said that my spirit had reminded them of him. And so I did feel a massive responsibility to try and communicate to the reader what he was like in the world. And that was one of the things that Dianne did also. When we went to sit with Cody, Jim's killer, she wanted him to know what he had taken from the world. And that was a powerful thing, because that was one of the reasons why she wanted to go. She wanted him to know what he had taken, and she sat and told him about Jim's life, and he listened. And there was an amazing atmosphere that operated in this triangle, as you so rightly say, the triangle between the three of us. But then outside the triangle sat Jim and the spirit of Jim, and it sort of completed things. And there was a wonderful tension that was going on there.
Yeah, and you bring this out as well. I'm not sure whether you want to talk about this, Dianne or Colum, but one of the things you stress is the unnaturalness of a child dying before their parent. It's a sort of almost like in a religious sense, I guess, a devilish quality. As the parent of two kids in their 20s, this is a very hard read. Why does it feel, or why does it appear so unnatural for a parent to lose their child?
I think we parents all want to go before our children. We want to see our kids grow and thrive. And that's why it's always the hardest, I think, to lose a child for a parent. I think it's just the natural way. We old folks should die first, it shouldn't be the other way around. Jim had so much potential. He was so talented, so much to give the world, so many gifts. And that's partly why we started the Foley Foundation, because I really wanted his spirit of goodness and moral courage to continue into the world, Andrew.
In fact, there are very, very few words as well. I mean, there are no words in the English language for a parent who has lost his child.
Yeah, you make that point. I thought that was a memorable point you make.
Yeah, and there are very few languages in which there is in Hebrew, there is in Sanskrit, there is also in Arabic.
I wonder, Colum, I was thinking about that. I wonder the reason for that might be is we all fear it so much, we don't even want to invent a word for it.
I believe so. I believe that it's so difficult for us to look at this, that we have a word widower, we have a widow, we have orphan, we have all of these things. But for that parent who experiences this incredible trauma, we decide that there's no word that we can that we can apply to it.
And this word unnatural, Colum, is unnatural for Dianne to lose her son. It's unnatural for Dianne to sit in a courtroom with his killer. It's unnatural for someone to execute someone live on the internet. Is this the word that perhaps joins the dots of this story, the unnaturalness of it all? And the fact that you, as a brilliantly gifted writer, are making it, in a sense, natural, or at least logical, and something that actually happened.
I like that you bring up the idea of the natural, because there are these opposites. There are the opposites. There's the life, there's the death, there's the creation, there's the faith, there's the lack of faith, there's the war, there's the search for peace. There are all these things that work in for and against one another. I mean, so much about what happened was unnatural to what we would call the human spirit, and yet it unfolded in a spectacularly natural way. The whole way that Dianne sat with him, talked with him. There were certain times when he actually took the photos of his own children and pushed them across the table for us to look at that, to say,
this is the killer, Coty.
That's right, because I mean, this is complicated. This is messy. I mean, we live in broken times, and we live in times when we all seem sort of diseased with certainty. Everyone, come into the room if you look like me, or you vote like me, or you sound like me. But what Dianne was saying is, I want to know, even though I have to cross these boundaries, to get to know somebody who many people would feel that she probably shouldn't have wanted to know, but she did. And that's what was truly extraordinary.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw it. There was a YouTube clip last week of a court scene somewhere in America where it was another murder trial, and the parents or the friends of the person murdered ran out of the court, or ran up to the court and started beating up the person accused of the murder, which is, I guess, Dianne, the reverse of what happened in your courtroom. Is that fair?
Yes, I think the big thing that came through to me is that, when we hate one another, everybody loses. The reality is, when we met with Alexander, it was really sad, because even though the justice is important, accountability is essential to deter the horrible crimes he committed, he will never see the light of day. I mean, he will always be imprisoned and most likely never see his family again. And of course, we lost Jim. The world lost him and his talent. Everybody lost. Everybody lost. And that, to me, it was very sad when you see the consequences of that kind of hatred, to me.
Yeah, reading the book, it was hard to get a grip on this guy, Coty. On the one hand, he was misrepresented in the British press, presented as a football fan, which he wasn't. Who knows what the truth is about him? And yet he does come out of this book with an element of dignity. Is that what you wanted, Colum, in terms of dealing with this guy?
Well, frankly, I was surprised by him. And I think Dianne and I were both surprised. The first couple of hours that we spent him, we had a little coffee break afterwards. We went out into a little room and we looked at each other and we said, well, not that we liked him, but that he was surprising us in certain ways. The way that he talked, the way that he thought. For example, he had a book on the table in front of him. I was dying to know what the book was, and because he heard my Irish accent, he started asking me a little bit about the IRA and the Irish peace process and these sort of things. And I said, "What's the book there in front of you?" And it was Patrick Radden Keefe's "Say Nothing," a wonderful book about Northern Ireland. But the bizarre thing about all of that was that I had blurbed that book, and my name was on the cover of the book, sitting there in front of him. There's no way that he could that he could have known this. And so there were lots of little things about him where Dianne would recognize his humanity. There were times when he, on the second day, he burst out into tears. I do think that it wasn't theater. I think he would have burst into tears on the first day if he'd wanted it to be absolute theater. There was something going on there, and yet there was always this moment of and yet, because he was repentant, but he didn't say that he was sorry for what he did. He was sorry for what had happened to Dianne and her family. Yet she had the great grace to, in the end, forgive him with this extraordinary sense of compassion.
Yeah, and Keefe also blurbed your book, so that adds to the remarkable number of coincidences, eerie coincidences. Dianne, do you think you could have forgiven without your religious faith? I know that's a bit of a dumb question.
Kind of hard to know, but my faith in a merciful God has been my rock. It's kept me together through all of this. So I know I really felt a supernatural spirit present in those 3 days, particularly the second day, Andrew. It was like all the people melted away, and Colin was right. There were many. There were, 20 people there, 25 people, but they all melted away, and it was just he and I, and it was, I think that was the most authentic day. That was the day he cried and shared about his children, his little girls, whom he may well never see again. And that's when he expressed remorse for what I had gone through anyway, and followed that up with 3 letters, which I didn't get till 6 months later. But nevertheless, there was something good. There was a grace present, Andrew, in those moments. There was a grace. There was something that allowed me to see him as a person. I had prayed for that. I have a son his age. So I had prayed that I could see him as a person with the good and the bad, just like all of us. And somehow I felt like the Lord gave me that grace. And
Yeah, and those letters put into the book. You have a large family, many children, a husband. Were you all on the same page, Dianne, on this, so to speak?
No, not at all. When we grieve, I really feel grief is a very unique journey. And my journey was really quite different than the rest of the families. And that's why I had no one who was willing to come with me to speak to Alexander, because my family wanted nothing to do with him. And it was Colum, who had become a friend at that point, who said, Dianne, I'll come. Colum was curious like Jim, and curious, wanted to hear Alexander's side of the story. Jim would have wanted to hear that side of the story. That's partly why I went, was because Jim would have wanted to hear him out. So I really felt that was very much the case.
Are all your family, your kids, many of them were in the services themselves, are they all sympathetic to this project? Did they try to convince you otherwise?
Yeah, they told me, why would you want to do that, Mom? What's that going to prove? They weren't strong about it. They just kind of ignored me. They ignored me when I started the foundation a little bit. Some of that was, hard for them. They were very close to Jim, but they're all young in their lives with young children, and had a need to get themselves together enough to move on, take care of their own families. And I understand that. Whereas I was retired and I had the space and energy to do something, to right the horrific wrong. So we're in very different places in our grief journey.
One of the other things that come out of the book is that you didn't, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't cry between hearing of his death and sometime during the trial. How would you explain that?
I'm not a big crier. I find that, if I start to cry, I really fall apart. So I cry when I pray and in private and that kind of thing. But yeah, I'm not.
Why did you cry when you met Coty?
Well, I think there was something about, he was the last one to see Jim in many ways. Once Jim was taken in 2012, we never saw him again until the day he was murdered. So we never heard his voice again.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like he had been with him those years. So there was something very intimate about that encounter in an odd way. I'm sure it's hard to understand, but
and there was something so overwhelmingly sad, as Dianne said. It was.
Yeah, there's no winners here, are there?
Right. There was no winners, and she said afterwards, it's just, I don't know if I have a word for this except sad, and the sadness itself is not enough. But if you can imagine just the moment in the room when she's been talking about Jim, and this man is there, and he is at the very least, he has written the last words of your son, and then he pushes forward these photographs of his own children who are in a camp in Syria. And you just think everyone is losing. it's not just Dianne, it's not just Cody, it's these three kids who are in Syria trying to make it into Turkey to find some sort of life then for themselves. So there was some, and there's also a moment of release, and I think there was a great humanity there in that room. For me, I mean, even though there were tears that day, and I had tears as well too. And you know, I'm a reporter, a journalist. I've seen some tough stuff, but for me, it was getting at the pulse. The pulse of the moment was absolutely extraordinary. There were other people in the room who were unable to sort of contain themselves as well, and there was a great faith that was going on as well. I mean, Diane's sense of faith and engagement. So we were also talking. We were talking about Islam. We were talking about Christianity and all of these things that you know. And there was a little bit of back and forth, a little bit of you know, parrying as the conversation went on, because you know, we didn't necessarily agree with him, and at times we said to each other, "Is he trying to exploit us? Is this all a? You know, is he duping us? Are we being naive?" But I don't think in the end that we had. I think Dianne knew exactly what was going on. There were times he thought he was the smartest guy in the room, but the person who thinks he's the smartest guy in the room is inevitably never the smartest guy in the room. And Diane's innate sense of human nature was on display.
Colum, when I was reading this, and I mean this in a complimentary way, there's a claustrophobic quality to this text. You're locked in a small room with these 2 or 3 characters all in a complex triangle. Is that what you were trying to do, to lock people into that small room?
Yeah, in many ways, and I do see it as a compliment. Samuel Beckett said in the early 1980s, he said, "It's the job of the artist now to find a form that accommodates the mess." And so the form of this book is in that room where Dianne is sitting 4 feet from her son's killer, and that whole sense that the room is there, but not only this room of forgiveness, but the torture room that was there as well, and then the room of the mind, and all of these things that were going on. So the book is framed so that we see Cody and the 2 days we spent with him and 1 day that we spent with him, and then in the middle, Dianne tells her story, and there's more of a sense of release in the middle of the book. But yeah, and it's a very short book as well, and clipped, and a lot of clipped sentences as well, for that sense of yeah, there's something important going on here. But yeah, you try to find a form or that accommodates the way the story is going to be received.
And were you trying, I mean, this is complicated as well, trying to, in a sense, hide yourself as the author?
Yeah.
I mean, you sort of melt into Dianne, or Dianne melts into you. You acquire her voice, but this is nonfiction.
Yeah, well, I was very conscious of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, for instance. And I was thinking that this book would operate along the lines of Capote. But Capote very obviously makes himself a character in that book. And one of the things that I didn't want to be was a character in this book, because Dianne is a spectacular character. Jim is a spectacular character. Between them is this other character who's rather mysterious. They don't need some Irish guy coming in and making himself. So I operate more or less like a fly on the wall, like third person omniscient narrator, and that's the way I want to see it. Sort of for the reader.
Yeah, and that omniscience, of course, raises the specter of God in a way, but of course you're not God. What couldn't you know for this book? What would you have liked to have known? Would you have liked to have been able to get into the mind of Coty to know whether or not he was being genuine in his apologies?
I wouldn't mind meeting him again. I actually sometimes think that this story is not finished. I'm sure that he's been writing letters, but we know that the letters haven't been able to get out of the prison.
Where is he now? Is he in Colorado in jail?
He's in Florence, Colorado, in high security prison, 23 and a half hours a day in prison. And you know what I actually think, and Dianne and I have talked about it a little bit. I'll let Dianne talk about it. I do think about those little girls. and they're going to be in their tweens now.
Where are they now, the girls? Are they back in London or are they still in Syria?
No, they're in northern Turkey. So they got out from Syria. They were in a camp, a very disturbing camp in Syria, what basically amounted to what would have been what we often call a rape camp. They were able to get out. They got the money to get out, and so Cody's wife managed to get out. I think that other part of the story is really fantastic, and it wouldn't surprise me if one day one of those young girls tried to certainly get in contact with her father, but maybe get in contact with Dianne as well. I don't even know how Dianne would feel about that.
Yeah, I could imagine Dianne, with your generosity, you'd probably take those girls in if their mother disappeared and they needed a home.
I would love to meet. I'd love actually to meet Alexander's mother, because
that was in the book as well. Some exchange of letters.
Yeah, to me, how heartbroken to have a son who was moved to do such horrific things and to not be able to see him. I mean, that's also another real sadness, right?
I thought that, I mean, it's not a polemical book, although there are a couple of polemical elements I want to get to. But if there is one convincing argument in the book, even if it is implicit, it's the argument against the death penalty. Do either of you want to take that one on?
Well, I felt quite strongly about that. I mean, I don't think an eye for an eye helps anyone. Everyone's blind, everyone's sad. And to me, I think it's much more of a punishment for Alexander to be put away for his life while he lives, so he has a chance to think about, maybe make amends, who knows what. Whereas some of the others were just killed by a drone. So to me, I'm very much against the death penalty. And to be honest, for them to be convicted in Virginia, we needed to have our country not allow them to be killed, that would not be an option for the UK to share their evidence. That was part of the deal with the UK, that if the UK shared their evidence with us, the death penalty would not be on the table. And
just to be clear, who made that? Which administration was that?
Well, it was in the Trump administration, but we were dealing with the UK. That's their law, that they are against the death penalty. So
when you say we, you mean the family or the case?
We had to, all of us 4 families had to agree. So initially, not all families agreed. And initially, Attorney General Barr wanted the death penalty, as did President Trump at that point.
I can imagine.
We persuaded, it took a while, but once all the families agreed that we did not want the death penalty, we did want the evidence from the UK, and we wanted them extradited to the US for trial, then that happened.
Colum, you noted earlier that you don't think this story has ended. That's the problem, of course, with the death penalty, is it's final, isn't it?
Exactly.
Well, yeah. And you don't want to turn justice into revenge.
Exactly.
That's exactly what ISIS would like to do. Exactly. And so you go about different. One of the spectacular things about this story is that Dianne really got the worst of American justice at the beginning, because they didn't look after her. They didn't do any form of negotiation. They said, we are not going to engage whatsoever. But when those men were captured and when they were brought to the United States, they weren't shipped off down to Guantanamo, and they weren't abused in the prison. They were actually given a chance at a spectacular form of justice. And the grand irony here is that I recently heard that the trial of his companion, Shafi al-Sheikh, cost over $75 million. That's a lot of money, and $75 million would have brought Jim and everybody else and dozens of others home if it had been applied 10 years earlier. But you can't look at this with hindsight and say but there was the prosecutors who worked on this case they were quite and they had full defense. They were given the best lawyers to argue their side of the case. They of course lost. Cody pleaded guilty to conspiracy to murder, conspiracy to hostage take, conspiracy to torture, and has 8 life sentences. But in the end, what's really interesting about this particular story is, for one of the first times, we actually like looked at these people and said, we are going to give you a proper trial, and they lost spectacularly.
Dianne, the book is marked by forgiveness on lots of fronts, but the one of the characters who, and I was surprised with this because I haven't followed this story that carefully, the one character who comes out of this perhaps with less than stellar colors, who you perhaps didn't entirely forgive, is Barack Obama. Is that fair?
Well, it was kind of complicated because Jim had actually campaigned for President Obama. I voted for him both times. I never even saw him until after Jim was killed. It certainly was not his fault, but he agreed very early on that our country was not going to negotiate for Jim. And to me, that should not be the American way. But that there was some precedent for it. Actually, before President Obama, other presidents did what they felt was best. Like President Bush would send in a rescue or do something. Barack just really felt that by engaging with the terrorists, it was going to incentivize more kidnapping. And there was no evidence of that, no research that showed that, but it was kind of an intuitive thing. So that's why the Foley Foundation also does research, so that our policies are in fact evidence-based, so that what we choose to do is based on evidence, because he essentially would not negotiate for the 4 Americans because he assumed it would incentivize more kidnapping. And therefore he just abandoned the 4 Americans.
Yeah, the way you wrote this column, there's a sense, maybe you articulate this from Dianne's point of view, that there's a little bit of heartlessness in Obama, that he made a brief call to them between golf rounds, and that he wasn't fully emotionally committed. Is that how you wanted to represent Obama in this narrative?
No, it's not how I wanted to represent him, but it's how it happened. And unfortunately, it's just how it happened. And you know what? I was with Dianne and we were talking through the story, and it's like, Dianne, I really don't want to tell this story about President Obama. I like him, but guess what? He sat in the White House and he sat down at a table. He was drinking tea, and he said to Dianne, your son was our highest priority. And Dianne said, frankly, Mr. President, he was not your highest priority, and that was the truth. But one thing that I have to say about this, because it is about forgiveness, Obama did go back in, and he started to, because of, I firmly believe, because of how that conversation had gone, he started to change presidential policy. He started to change how we think about hostages. And then even later on in this whole thing, Dianne invited him to come speak during the pandemic to the Foley Foundation, and he agreed, and he graciously agreed and gave his time. And we all look back, we all make mistakes, but at the beginning, oh gosh, I didn't want to write about that. He was one of my heroes, but it was there, right, Dianne?
Exactly. And he's more than made amends in many ways. I mean, obviously couldn't bring Jim back, but he realized he had to do better. And he is the one who actually initiated the hostage review, all of government review, that established our current hostage enterprise that includes people at the State Department, FBI, and White House, whose job it is to take care of the families of innocent Americans who were kidnapped or wrongfully arrested abroad. So he initiated that structure, which then went into law with the Robert Levinson law.
Yeah, it's interesting. A few years ago, we had the CNN reporter Clarissa Ward on the show. I'm sure you know her.
Of course, yeah.
And she is deeply unforgiving of And she's like you. I think she overall admires Obama, but she's deeply unforgiving of his Syria policy.
Not the best, not his best stroke. I mean, none of us are perfect, right? But that was a very clear area that wasn't his best, right? But again, that happens to all of us. And that's why I had to forgive him, recognize his mortality, and the fact that he went on to do something about it. You know, they did the review, they looked at how can we help bring innocent people home when this happens. So it's thanks to him in many ways that nearly 150 innocent Americans have come home.
If he's still around, Jim, looking down on us, I wonder if he'd have an ironic smile at the fall of Assad in the last few months.
Oh, yeah, just an answer to a prayer. So I just pray that their country can get it together. That's the hard part. This is the really scary, fragile.
Yeah, and then there's some people might say, well, but it's the ISIS people who have defeated the Alawites, and that these organizations now have power. Is there any truth to that in Syria today? It's such a complicated situation.
It is, but the guy that's taken over was really with al-Nusra, not so much ISIS. So I'm really hopeful that he was one of the, rebels that was fighting against Assad, definitely. And I hope that his best interest, all we can do is hope that he
Can
really.
I just say that you bring up a powerful point, and I think it's really, really important. If Jim was here, in many ways, Jim's influence is still, like when he died, his influence entered the air, and in certain ways, it continues to gather and gather and gather. So, like death will take away a lot of things, but it won't take away your stories. And he was really interested in these ideas of moral courage, getting to know people across the boundaries, doing all these things. And in a certain way, I think Jim would look down and say, well, I'm glad that you guys are talking about that today. I'm glad that's not something that's going to be shoved away and not talked about, because we need to talk about these things. And that's why he went to Syria. That's why he went back a second time. He put his life on the line.
And he knew how those people were yearning for that freedom, just yearning for it. So that's why I pray that this new group that's come in will do right by their opportunity.
Finally, there's so much here, such a heart-wrenching and yet inspiring story. What would Jim, Dianne, make of the current situation, do you think, in the Middle East? Did he have he was in Libya, or he was in Syria, spent a lot of time risking his life, and in the end he paid with his life. What was his narrative of the American responsibility in the Middle East?
Well, he felt very privileged. I think the more he saw what other people go through just to have some of the freedom we have, they're willing to lay down their life, leave their country, do whatever it takes. So I think he would have been thrilled to for the Syrian people to have this opportunity. I know he would be. But he also knew everything is very fragile, and that democracy is tough to maintain, tough to achieve. These are, I think, just when his experience of people and their yearning, I mean, even teenagers, children, they're yearning for the freedoms that our kids, have every day. He really, really believed that we Americans needed to see that so we could value what we have in many ways.
Finally, Colum, intellectually or artistically, what are the lessons we need to draw from this? I mean, one of the things that struck me, and maybe I'm being unfair, is the media did a rather bad job glamorizing these ISIS people, calling them the Beatles. The media doesn't come out of this very well. I mean, you're part of the media, and I guess this book, in a sense, is a way of trying to right a wrong. But what can we learn from this about reporting on evil, or at least perceived evil?
That's a good question. I mean, one of the things about evil is that for evil to exist, it only has to happen once. For good to exist, it has to happen over and over and over again. And you see in the media that it's easier to concentrate on that one act of evil that then exists, and it's harder for people to talk about the good stuff that's constantly unfolding, because it is actually more difficult to write about the good stuff, and that's part of what I wanted people to understand in this book. That yes, it's dark, and yes, there's some really tough stuff to deal with, but in the end, you have this life that was a fantastic life. You have this woman, Dianne Foley, who comes out and creates a foundation that changes things on the ground, and that changes it is still possible. I think that he would have said, we don't have to love each other, and we don't even have to even like each other, but we must understand one another. And that was one of the things that he did as a reporter and as a writer. And he would call on all of us to continue talking about this stuff and not bury our heads in the sand, and continue to talk about the hostages and the way the world works.
And then, Dianne, very finally, perhaps remind everyone of your foundation, and should they become members? Are you looking for donations? How can people help if we read the book and care about these issues?
Sure. Well, we would invite any Americans. This really is a national security issue, because we want to be able to travel. We Americans love traveling, and we need reporters, aid workers, businessmen, journalists to go out into the world. Yes, we work to prioritize the return of any Americans that are taken hostage abroad and promote journalist safety. Yes, this is a very important part of Jim's legacy, in my opinion. FoleyFoundation.org, JamesFoleyFoundation.org. We would welcome anybody who would support our work. And one thing of interest, the term Beatles, a lot of the hostages, Jim was with many European hostages, and they would together come up with things that were humorous, and they came up with the name Beatles, because these guys.
So we can't blame the media
for that one. Anyway, but thank you. Yes, that would be.
Well, this is I wasn't quite sure how to describe you both. I wasn't sure whether to call Colum, whether you're co-authors or whether Colum's the author and Dianne's the mother of the boy, the young Jim Foley, who was killed. But this is a genuine partnership. You are literally and metaphorically co-authors of this wonderful book. It's not a new book. It's now in paperback now. It's a central reading. I want to thank you both. And it's a real honor to talk to you both. Thank you so much.
It's our honor.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
So much.
Thank you.